When does pressure from someone in the government cross the line into censorship? That might be the most important question surrounding some of the biggest news stories right now, but the media doesn't even seem to be asking it, let alone trying to answer it. This issue is playing out in the ongoing cultural battle over late-night comedy, but not just there. The Pentagon has announced a new policy that is so obviously against press freedoms that Fox and some Republicans are calling it out. Meanwhile, according to some headlines, Google is saying that the Biden administration subjected the company to censorship pressure. But is that what Google's really saying? Coming up, I'll explain all this and help you understand what's going on. Plus, Kamala Harris is out doing the media rounds now for her book. Her big first interview showed some things that are wrong with the media. News organizations are so caught up in a limited way of thinking that they're not looking for the most important information. Also today, an overall good conversation between two people on another network in which some important basics were acknowledged. If only the journalist who conducted that interview would apply the same rule to himself, always. And an analysis of partisan violence finds something big and new this year. Most of the mainstream media, however, is ignoring or burying that. All that and more coming up today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. So good to have you here. I'm Josh Levs, and this is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact-checks the news. If you've listened before, then you probably know by now. I spent 20 years in mainstream media, 10 on NPR, 10 on CNN, where I was the lead on-air fact-checker. But I've always seen how desperately the media itself needs fact-checking. Those of you who have been tuning in are making this show possible. Thank you so much. I get amazing messages from you all. Some of them come in as voice messages, like this.
Hi, Josh. This is Hunter from Lone Star, Texas. I just wanted to say that your show, They Stand Corrected, means so much to me. I really look at your show not just as a podcast, but it is literally my go-to source now for news. Now, I go to other resources like I'm sure you do to research and gather information, but I grew up in a time when Walter Cronkite was on television and you trusted that person to bring you the news. Sadly, over the last decade or so, I can't trust the person that's on the news to tell me exactly what's going on out there with any kind of truthfulness or accuracy. But They Stand Corrected gets that done. I'm an avid fan of your show, and I'm going to continue listening. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Hunter. That means so much. I have said that I will share messages like this on the show, and I so appreciate them. And I'm simultaneously aware that it can be a very humble brag. But here's the thing. In lots of professions, there are concrete results. If you work for a business, you might see that you have reached your quarterly sales targets. Or if you're a teacher, you might see that a student has learned something. Maybe their grades improve. A lawyer can win a case, please a client. A doctor can help heal someone. These are all pragmatic things. In what I do, it's literally air. The pragmatic results are people saying, I'm getting something out of this. So that's why it means so much. Okay, enough of that. Let's jump into the news. Former Vice President Kamala Harris is out selling her book now about the brief time when she was the Democratic presidential candidate in the 2024 election. Her first big interview was with Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, of course. I have explained how this is typical for how the media works. Rachel is excellent at calling out craziness on the right, but in keeping with the way MSNBC works, almost never calls out craziness on the left. That echoes what happens on the right, in which people call out the craziness on the left, but not in their camp. The mainstream media calls out problems on the right, but not on the left. All right, this interview highlighted a couple of problems that are going on with big media nationwide. At one point, Maddow brought up how Harris wants there to be a bench of future Democratic talent, future so-called stars.
Arguably the fastest rising star right now in Democratic politics is Zohran Mamdani, who is going to be elected mayor of New York City. probably in a landslide if the polls are anything to go by. What do you think of him and his candidacy? And what do you think of mainline Democratic shyness and agitation about the prospect that he's going to win?
Look, as far as I'm concerned, he's the Democratic nominee and he should be supported.
But do you endorse his candidacy?
I support the Democrat in the race, sure. But let me just say this. He's not the only star. He's in New York, and I know New Yorkers think they're the center of the world.
It is the biggest city in the country.
And I love New York. But, I mean, there are people like Barbara Drummond in Mobile, Alabama, Helena Moreno in New Orleans.
I was so glad she said that. This speaks to multiple issues I've talked about here. There's geographic bias. Most big national news organizations are based in New York. Meanwhile, the vast majority of Americans don't care who Zohran Mamdani is. But in New York, it's, oh, he's such a star. And that is cyclical for how the media works. Take a guy they like, especially there in New York, put him not just on the local media, but on the national media that's based there, and then declare that he's a star, as though somehow that just happened organically. Also, I've reported on this. The last election showed that the country has moved to the right. Voters saw Kamala as being too far to the left. They saw her as being more partisan compared to them than Trump. That's what the first real extensive analysis of the election showed. So the idea that Mamdani, a left-wing socialist candidate, is somehow the solution, that is very myopic. But it gets way worse than that. I did an episode about this guy, Mamdani, and how dangerous he is. He has announced that as mayor, he would carry out an illegal extrajudicial arrest. And the fact that the person that he says he would arrest is someone that his supporters don't like, that should make no difference. Democrats cannot call out Trump and ICE for what they're saying are extrajudicial illegal arrests while celebrating, voting for, and extolling as a star a guy who has announced he would do exactly that. It is openly hypocritical. You can't have it both ways. But of course you would not hear that on MSNBC. But there's something even bigger that happened in this interview. Harris wrote in her book that her first choice for vice president was former Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who openly identifies as gay. In the book, she writes, quote, "We were already asking a lot of America to accept a black woman married to a Jewish man. Part of me wanted to say, screw it, let's just do it. But knowing what was at stake, it was too big a risk." Buttigieg has now responded. He said, "You earn trust with voters based mostly on what they think you're going to do for their lives, not on categories." This was the topic of a somewhat awkward exchange between Maddow and Harris. There were lots of ums and uhs along the way. I'm just going to share a couple little clips with you here.
I wonder if his reaction to that, if you've had any reflection on that, or I guess I'd ask you to just elaborate on that a little bit. It's hard to hear.
In 107 days against someone like Donald Trump, who knows no floor, to be a black woman running for president of the United States and as a vice presidential running mate, a gay man, with the stakes being so high, it made me very sad, but I also realized it would be a real risk.
And Harris said maybe she was being too cautious and that she's just being candid about it now. Asking her about that makes sense, but look what she was not asked about. Why she thought Pete Buttigieg would be a good vice president. I haven't read the book yet. I don't know everything that's in there, but I do know that in the coverage, that's not even coming up. He was mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and then lost his only statewide race, but really wanted to have a national political presence. So he ran for the presidential nomination back in 2020 and lost. He built up enough of a name that he was appointed transportation secretary under Biden. He was in that office during the supply chain crisis that stemmed from COVID. And there was no sign that I saw that he had some great skills at solving those problems. There were a lot of mistakes. And sadly, that is normal for people who are put in cabinet positions because in the weird political system, presidents don't look for people who have specific expertise on most topics. It's just this reward that you get from behind the scenes agreements to endorse a candidate. Anyway, maybe Buttigieg does have some track record that shows he has the knowledge and skills to serve as vice president and as president if need be. But what are they? Why choose him? Here's what's going on in the media. Especially once Trump's candidacy the first time took off in 2016, he was openly sexist and racist, especially against Latinos, saying that a Latino judge couldn't be trusted because of his heritage. The Democratic Party and left-wing and mainstream media went into this daily process of looking for prejudiced things that Trump said about groups of people. And that became this new core identity, talking about how you stand up for the rights of certain minority groups. And they're kind of stuck there. There was a recent story about openly gay members of the Trump administration and how all these people in the administration want to be their friend. Things have changed. I'm not saying there's no bigotry, but these days, the mainstream media is more likely to be talking about these kinds of minority categories and making them the subject. Meanwhile, the presidency and vice presidency are jobs. They're like the ultimate temp jobs. The American people need to understand that. We need to stop having these positions presented as being about popularity contests and instead have the media focus on what the job is, what skills and knowledge it takes to do it well, and why. Kamala Harris chose Tim Walz, governor of Minnesota. He has much bigger executive experience than Buttigieg. So why wasn't he a better choice? I would love to hear her explain that. And by the way, as a fact check, I should note that while Buttigieg says people don't go by categories, when he was looking to enter national politics, just about any time he was challenged about anything, he would go straight to reminding people that he's openly gay and served in the military, as though that had anything to do with the question they were asking about. So he did capitalize on fixation with categories. I know some people love him. Great. Love him all you want. Give Kamala a chance to explain what it is about him that would make him so good at that particular job. Meanwhile, a bunch of listeners have sent me links about the disgusting Tucker Carlson, who used Charlie Kirk's funeral to push his anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. There was a good conversation about this on News Nation with host Chris Cuomo.
What I heard from Tucker at the memorial, he just openly basically wants to say, forget about this punk with the gun. Look at Israel. There is a malignancy that is going on in our society.
He was speaking with conservative author Douglas Murray. Murray talked about how this kind of thing is happening among some people on the right, not just Tucker Carlson.
That is just the most basic, low-resolution, conspiracy theory-minded pap you can ever get into.
Murray pointed out that there is, of course, all this anti-Semitism on the left. He does a great job of railing against that. And he pointed out something happening on the right. He noted that Charlie Kirk had railed against Islamist terrorists and against trans people. Currently, the indications are that the shooter had a roommate who is trans. That roommate was apparently shocked and disgusted by what this shooter did. Douglas Murray said, it's worth noting that conspiracy theorists are not pushing ideas that the shooter was an Islamist terrorist, and they're not trying to blame trans people. He talked about the mindset of nonsensically trying to pin this shooting somehow on Jewish people.
Imagine in that situation to decide I'm actually going to push aside the facts, even though they could be useful to some of the arguments I make, because I would rather blame the Jews.
Yeah, but you know why? It works better. If the numbers on the bottom of the thumbnail are not big enough to justify the profits you want and to keep you in the mix with the names that are populating the trending hashtags, then you're not going to say it. And the Jews resonate with division. And the trans don't. They are a beleaguered minority.
By beleaguered minority, Chris seemed to mean the way the left sees trans people. There is, of course, still raging anti-transphobia among people on the far right. While Chris used some confusing mixed metaphors in there, I get the idea. He's saying one of these things sells every time on the left and right. It gets you bigger numbers. There is increasing cross-pollination between the far left and the far right. They both need a scapegoat and go for the Jews, and when they do, extremists on the other side help spread what they are saying. That, in turn, builds up the platforms of these haters and helps them monetize. I appreciate what Chris did in this segment on News Nation, but Chris also had on his podcast a disgusting anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist named Jackson Hinkle. Chris called him a head of a next generation of political thought. This guy Hinkle is so awful and extreme that left-wing agencies, the Daily Beast and Haaretz, called him out. I posted about it at the time. So Chris, just like everyone else in the media, needs to take their own words to heart. If you want to help stop the spread of hateful lies in search of profits, don't book people like that. The hatred fueling violence is the context for a battle the country is now facing over censorship and the First Amendment. Coming up, a central point the media is missing, one we all need to focus on. There is a 3-step dance the media uses to spread lies. In the newsletter, I break down what those 3 steps are so you can recognize what's happening every time you see it. It's a performance that swings public opinion and radicalizes people. That is just one of the many things you'll learn in the newsletter. It's designed to complement this show, giving you facts, sources, videos, photos, and more. Unlike the media, I don't expect you to take my word for anything. The newsletter is also where people send in their ideas and requests for topics to cover on this show. And there's another feature. Sometimes you probably hear someone say something that you know is false because you heard about it here, and you want to find where that was so you can send them a link. Well, here's how it works. When you go to the main page of the newsletter, you can type in any topic or the name of a news agency, just about anything, and it will show you where I have addressed that topic. It will bring you to the facts, which you can then share. I also have email addresses for major news sites and instructions for you to send messages to the leaders so you can let them know what they're doing wrong. The newsletter is free, but this show relies on your support, and the best way to support the show is to become a paid subscriber to the newsletter. When you do that, I reward you with exclusive content, I read messages from you on the show, and I help you save lots of money by accessing major news sites for free legally. To find the newsletter, check out the show notes or my website, joshlebs.com. You'll see a direct link. The newsletter is on a platform called Substack. If you're already on Substack, just look me up by name or by the title. They stand corrected. Thank you. When he returned to the air, Jimmy Kimmel said he never meant to make light of the murder of Charlie Kirk. Now, how people feel about what he's been saying, whether it's enough or not enough, all that's subjective. But he also took the opportunity to draw attention to some facts.
Brendan Carr, the chairman of the FCC, telling an American company, we can do this the easy way or the hard way, and that these companies can find ways to change conduct and take action on Kimmel, or there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead, in addition to being a direct violation of the First Amendment, is not a particularly intelligent threat to make in public. Ted Cruz said he sounded like a mafioso. Although, I don't know, if you want to hear a mob boss make a threat like that, you have to hide a microphone in a deli and park outside in a van with a tape recorder all night long. This genius said it on a podcast.
It's true. Carr said that. He and Trump have both indicated that the government would be willing to take action against ABC. The First Amendment bans Congress from making any laws that prohibit or abridge freedom of speech. And the U.S. Supreme Court has long made clear that that applies to the entire federal government, not just the legislative branch. Kimmel pointed out that Carr and Trump have previously talked about how crucial it is to have freedom of speech. I found it really interesting that in his first night back, Kimmel also said this.
Over the weekend, his foxy friend Pete Hegseth announced a new policy that requires journalists with Pentagon press credentials to sign a pledge promising not to report information that hasn't been explicitly authorized for release. That includes unclassified information. They want to pick and choose what the news is. I know that's not as interesting as muzzling a comedian, but it's so important to have a free press, and it is nuts that we aren't paying more attention to it.
Yup. That was probably the first time many Americans knew this is happening. It is, and it's so disturbing that Fox went after the Trump administration over this. They had on their legal analyst, Jonathan Turley of George Washington University Law School.
This is actually quite breathtaking in terms of its implications for the free press. There is no precedent for what they're doing here. Now, it is true that access is something that is a privilege. At the CIA, reporters, journalists are not allowed just to wander as widely as they do in the Pentagon. But the Pentagon has had a long tradition of allowing the media to work with its own representatives and getting the story right. Now, there have been times where the press has published what was classified information. Some of those cases are the most significant in our country, like the Pentagon Papers, that produced great reforms that informed the public of things that they had to know about. This measure is simply a bridge too far.
This gets at something that happens inside newsrooms that not everyone knows about. When a news agency gets hold of classified information, the news agency generally will have conversations about whether or not the information in there is worth reporting. And there might be concerns about sources and methods, about safety of U.S. military or U.S. spies or something else that could affect the country's security. So they'll have conversations with people in the government. The government can present their arguments as to why the media should not report what's in there. And in the end, the government has to let the news organization make its decision. And then the public can judge the news organization. If they think that news organization should not have released the information, they can say that. They can boycott it. And sometimes classified information gets released and it turns out that another organization had that a year earlier and chose not to report it. And people can judge the news agency for that. All that is part of freedom of expression. What the Pentagon's talking about here is a whole different idea, trying to get people to agree that they won't even report information that's unclassified. Keep in mind, this is the same department that copied in a journalist on a private signal chat about war plans. Now they're trying to get journalists to sign this. Here's one more clip from Turley.
What they're basically saying is if you publish anything that's not in the press release, is not the official statement of the Pentagon, you could be held responsible under this policy. That is going to create a stranglehold on the free press.
Yep. At the same time as this, some listeners sent me articles with headlines like this, quote, Google admits censorship pressure from Biden administration. That is on Yahoo News from Dallas Express, and there are some others like it. So amid all the concerns about censorship from the Trump administration, there's this new wave of concern about whether the Biden administration engaged in censorship. To understand this, we need to drill down clearly on what did and did not happen. First, these headlines are using the term censorship pressure. I checked with Google. They have not used that term. It was not in the letter that they submitted to Congress. And I reached out to the press team at Google asking whether they think that term is accurate here. So far, I have not heard back, and that's typical. Companies often just try to avoid saying anything on incendiary political stuff. They always want to make nice to whoever is in power. And right now, Republicans are in power. Here is what Google did write in its letter to a Republican-led committee investigating this. This letter says, senior Biden administration officials, including White House officials, conducted repeated and sustained outreach and pressed the company regarding certain user-generated content related to the COVID-19 pandemic that did not violate its policies. Now, this letter continues that while the company continued to develop and enforce its policies independently, Biden administration officials continued to press the company to remove non-violative user-generated content. And Google wrote here that President Biden created a political atmosphere that sought to influence the actions of platforms based on their concerns regarding misinformation. The letter says it is unacceptable and wrong when any government, including the Biden administration, attempts to dictate how the company moderates content, and the company has consistently fought against those efforts on First Amendment grounds. Google also said it was reinstating some accounts that were dropped at the time. Okay, so Google's making this argument that the Biden administration pressed them to remove information. Is that censorship? Well, that is why I gave you all this information just now in this order. Remember what I was just saying. Government officials can meet with media to argue why something should not be reported. But in the end, they have to let the media decide. Government officials can call on outlets and platforms to make changes that the people in power think would be good. Last week, I mentioned how Representative Richie Torres, a Democrat, called on this platform Twitch, which is owned by Amazon, to stop platforming and praising this pro-terror far-left figure, Hassan Piker. But Torres did not say, if you don't do this, we will use the power of government to punish you. So governments can argue. They can call for private companies to make certain decisions. At what point, though, does pressure become censorship? For example, if there's a clear indication that a government official is saying, we will do something about this as the government, that can be seen as censorship in violation of the freedom of speech. Did the Biden administration do that? This stuff gets subjective. So journalistically, these headlines that I was just mentioning are inaccurate, are misleading. If Google does not use the term censorship pressure, then the news media should not be saying that Google is accusing the Biden administration of censorship pressure. That is also a bridge too far. To his credit, Jimmy Kimmel said the FCC has interfered under multiple administrations. And I can tell you, neither party has a lock on protecting the First Amendment. Unfortunately, the media for years has been using the term censorship in various ways that are not always accurate, and that has left a lot of Americans confused as to what legal protections even exist. There was a survey from the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania. It found that 51% of Americans incorrectly believe that the First Amendment's protection of freedom of speech means that Facebook must permit all Americans to freely express themselves on Facebook pages. So just over half that don't know that private companies can choose what speech to allow. In all the coverage of what's been going on, have you seen clarity about this in any big mainstream outlet? If so, I'd love to see it. Send it to me. If we're going to fight peacefully to protect something as precious as freedom of speech, as the First Amendment, we need to know what it is. Speaking of that fight, something we can do after this. As this episode comes out, there is yet another risk of a federal government shutdown. This one's different. Because the Trump administration has dropped so many people from the federal government, some agencies are already on skeletal staff at this point, and a shutdown could have widespread effects. Even if this is temporarily delayed, the threat continues. There is a great website that can help you see how this could affect you. So check out the newsletter and the show notes, and you'll see why that link is also helpful to this show. Meanwhile, as this comes out, President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have announced yet another offer to Hamas to end one of the wars going on in the world. That has initial support from Arab leaders, including the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. I'll be keeping an eye on the coverage, but here's something I can tell you about it for now. There is a central point that is in this plan that the media just does not understand, and that is the need for de-radicalization. I did an episode about this. I looked back at the denazification of Germany after World War II and how essential that was, and how it transformed Germany and set it on a path toward democracy. I'll bring you more on that next week. At the top, I mentioned a new study of partisan violence in America. It shows that incidents of left-wing violence now outnumber incidents of right-wing violence. To people who have been following mainstream media, that would seem shocking, but that's something I've been warning about since the beginning of this show, about a year and a half ago. People inside each camp don't realize the extent of the problems in their own camp. And that's because the media is not doing the job of helping people understand big picture, what's going on. This show is fighting the good fight, working to get the truth out there so we can come together around facts. And we can come together around stances for justice, like the fight to ensure freedom of speech, freedom of expression. In order to take these stances together, we need to be looking at facts. So anything and everything you do to share this show and support this show, it means so much. That's what allows this process to continue. When you rate and review it on the podcast apps, you are triggering the algorithms. When you send the show to individual friends and contacts of yours and say, I really think you would find this particular episode interesting, you are helping grow that effort. I'm so grateful to all of you who are doing this. Thank you. Oh, quick programming note. Next week's episode will come out a day early because of an anniversary that it marks. So check your feeds next week, one day earlier than usual. As always, thank you so much for listening. I will see you next week.